Hey guys, hello from the great white north, and it's such a privilege to even be able to get this done. Hopefully everything works out technologically to be able to pass this through. But before I get started, I just wanted to just say how much I miss you guys, and just the presence of being in the classroom with you guys and all the professors. It's sorely missed. And I know Chelsea feels the same way with being with the ladies and all the moms. And so we just send just a great hello. Thank you for all the prayers. Just being online, being through the Polycom system. I know you guys have been praying for us and been talking about us. Positive and negative, we hear everything. Polycom kind of gives you a sense of omnipresence through all the campuses. So yes, I hear everything you guys are saying. I just want to say thank you for all your prayers and all your support, emails and notes and everything. We really appreciate it. But while we're here is to present Zephaniah. It's been just a treat to watch you guys walk through your texts and explain how you got there and why you got there, and just this project as a whole, hopefully for you guys, has been as beneficial as it was for me, because I've wholeheartedly enjoyed this project, just getting a worm's eye view of the text and having to explain, having to come to conclusions in the text. It might have shown that my future is not in writing commentaries, and that's okay, but still, nonetheless, it's been a sweet privilege to do so. So I just want to start out by reading the text that I had. So I know we're a little bit past it now, but it is Zephaniah 1:7 through 10. So I'll begin reading the text, and then we'll get in. Be silent before the Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. For the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated his guests. Then it will come about on the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes, the king's sons, and all who clothe themselves with foreign garments. And I will punish on that day all who leap on the temple threshold, who fill the house of their Lord with violence and deceit. On that day, declares the Lord, there will be a sound of a cry from the fish gate, a wail from the second quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. So I just wanted to make a quick note. You should have my notes there in front of you. I wasn't able to make a presentation because of my distance from you, but so I'll basically be talking right from the notes from the most part. But I just want to let you know why I structured the way that I did the commentary. As I was going through all of the Zephaniah commentaries, it was a little bit tricky, as you guys well know, going through and trying to find specific verses and phrases in the commentary, because the commentaries aren't big. Some of the Zephaniah commentaries only were about 3 to 5 pages max, and so trying to find where I was at was pretty difficult. And so I was just thinking, is there an easier way, better way? And this was my version. So what I did was I just separated out the clauses, even in the English, gave a couple different translations just to see what the texts were doing, just so you had it right there in front of you. So hopefully that was helpful. Maybe it wasn't. I'd really like some feedback to think through, hey, when you saw this commentary, would it be helpful if you had it in print form to see it in this way, kind of separated by the clauses, so just so you can flip to it and you know exactly where you're at. So it'd just be interesting what you guys thought. So any feedback, emails, or even when I get back to class, it'd be helpful just to think through exactly how the commentary worked. So, first clause in verse 7, be silent before the Lord. The be silent, the has here is an interjection. It's a really strong verbal force, really kind of emotive, coming right at the Judean people. Because here you have the Lord speaking basically from verse 2 all the way to verse 6, and then you have Zephaniah piping in. He's jumping in here before the people of God, and whether there's some sort of commotion in his mind or what he's thinking, it's hard to know, but obviously he's trying to stop them in their tracks, and this is exactly what this is doing. Think about like a freight train. Here in Jupiter, well, when you're in Jupiter there's like a cement mixing company which passes through cars all the time. And so sometimes there will be 25 to 50 cars full of gravel, which is going to be made into cement. And I always think, what would happen if that thing was going full speed and then you just got a wall and it just stopped right in its tracks? What would that look like? What kind of destruction would that be because of the force and the inertia? And so think about this. Judah is going through their lives as if nothing's wrong. They're going through, they're thinking, hey, we're a blessed people, we're going through everything normal. And then here comes Zephaniah. He's giving an interjection. He's giving a strong pronouncement like this. It's an imperatival force. The Has here is an imperative, a PL imperative. It's right in your face. It's a command. You can't do anything about it. It's in the PL. It's in the causative. Or not the causative, but the forceful aspect of the verb. And so we're thinking, what would it be like for the people of Judah to receive this message? So the translations are pretty simple. It's like a hush, or a keep silent, or a be quiet. The King James Version, it's a little more interpretive with hold thy peace. But I really think like a hush or a be quiet, a loud be quiet is really what he's after here. And it's nice, you can see it in the text. It's actually kind of paragraphed out a little bit. It's not it is a standalone sentence. It's not grammatically subordinate to anything. And so you kind of have in verse 6, the end of verse 6, you have Yahweh's done talking, and then you have the third person here with Zephaniah going, be quiet. Just stop and listen, because there is a message that you need to hear, and it's from Yahweh himself. So after the interjection, you have the prepositional phrase, before the Lord God. So this is basically saying, hey, be silent before God. Be quiet before God. You have nothing to say. You need to stop. There's a message here that you need to listen to. And so it's really interesting, just the combination of the word here, the Adonai Yahweh. What it's really doing is it's establishing Yahweh's sovereign rulership. The NIV translates it in a specific way, sovereign Lord, instead of just the literal rendering of Lord God as some of the other translations do. But here's what I think he's doing. It's specifically reestablishing sovereign authority, because if you look back even in verse 4, it's talking about how Jerusalem was worshiping the god of Baal. And so what he needed to do was reestablish that sovereign authority, and it was really a needed juxtaposition in this specific time, in this specific point in history. So what he's doing is Yahweh's commanding submission. And one of the commentators puts it this way: Jehovah is the covenant God, and such he is Lord, the supreme God, who has the right to demand what he will and the power to enforce his will. Hush, silence before him. This is the call to the people of Judah to cease any manner of opposition to God's word and will, to bow down in submissive obedience, in unconditional surrender, in loving service to their covenant God. And I think that really just captures what he's trying to do here with the interjection. Stop them in their tracks, declare sovereign authority, and to make sure that they're listening up. Because there is a message. Moving on to the second part of verse 7. For the day of the Lord is near. So the key here helps us clarify, hey, there is a purpose here. There's something that's going to happen. Listen up, for something will take place. The key here is categorized as evidential. It's focusing on what the speaker will say in anticipation to what he meant in the previous clause. Because the day of the Lord is near is a possible translation. So you're thinking about, okay, what's he going to say next? And I really like Waltke's case on this, his take on it. He takes a position that this particular key is more of an emphatic clause, clausal adverb actually, really giving it a lot more force. For indeed the day of the Lord is near. So hush, be silent before the Lord God, for indeed the day of the Lord is near. The day of the Lord is coming. And we get to our Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord. It's really it's a broad subject, and it was really difficult in that short period of time to really try to get a grasp of what the day of the Lord is. And so I tried the best that I could to try and get as much general information as possible, what in the whole of Scripture is it pertaining to, and then specifically maybe what in Zephaniah. And I found it very difficult. But Zephaniah, for the short little book, is just ripe with this terminology. It's ripe with the day of the Lord terminology and its overall concept in the Scriptures. Greg King wrote an article and basically said every major section of the book and every unit should be linked to Zephaniah's teaching on the day of the Lord. Van Gemeren goes on to say, Zephaniah most extensively and dramatically developed the prophetic concept of the day of the Lord. So, studying it for 6 weeks to a couple months in that even short period of time to develop an entire book, and even in just this short section was very difficult. And so I'm excited to see the other areas where you guys have studied this specific phrase and developed this theology a little bit more. But it's mainly judgment. It's mainly judgment, but there is a twofold aspect of the day of the Lord in that there is a divine blessing. If you go down all the way to chapter 3, you'll see in verse 11, in that day you will feel no shame because of all of your deeds by which you have rebelled against me, for then I will remove from your midst your proud exalted ones, and you will never again be haughty on my holy mountain. So in that day, and then he goes on to say, hey, look, there's going to be blessings when this judgment happens for those who actually do turn and do come to me. So it's not holy judgment, but it's mainly judgment in this context, especially from 7 to 10, and actually most of 1. But the day of the Lord, since it is the judgment context, it's because they sinned. It's because they sinned against Yahweh, as 1 verse 17 says. And then verses 1 and 2 in chapter 1, it's judgment against even all the animate creatures and all of the judgment aspects of it. As it says, from the face of the earth. So it's really interesting, just the entire concept of this, just being evaluated. I try to evaluate it in a couple different ways, both historical and eschatological, because it seems like there's so many times where Israel, Judah, Jerusalem itself is judged in the Old Testament scriptures, and even in the future. Eschatologically, it seems that the Day of the Lord terminology moves over on into the New Testament. And so it's a broad subject with a lot of areas where it's very difficult to get into the nuances. But right here, in this specific context, what it's doing, it's pronouncing judgment on Judah, on the specific ways which we'll get into, how they have sinned against the Lord. So some of the ways have been already seen in verses 2 through 6, but 1, 7 through 10 here, there's really specific ways why Judgment Day is going to be coming. So, and it does say near, and I just think that that's an interesting concept. What does he mean by near? Is it going to be right away? Is it going to be in the future? But obviously, to some degree, this is going to happen very, very soon, very quickly, and we just don't know specifically when, because of, hey, there's specific people that we're going to talk about in the next couple verses about when and who exactly he is coming to. So this day is specifically given to Yahweh, the day of Yahweh. So the construct form really gives it that extra added punch of, hey, it possesses to Yahweh. It's given by Yahweh because he possesses the day and he will actually render judgment. And so coming up next, we're going to see that specifically what he has done. And verse 7c says, for the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. So the prophet begins to display the nearness of the day, the tangible aspects of the day, And we have the key starting out, which is, it's really interesting that the NIV and the ESV leave this out, because I think the subordination really talks about the for indeed aspect of it again. So, hush be solemn before the Lord, for the day of the Lord is near, for the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. All of these things is kind of rushing like water coming down, saying, you guys better watch out, because it is coming, and it's coming quickly. So he's preparing a sacrifice. It's like a feast. It's, the language that's here would be recognized a lot by Judah. It'd be recognized by anybody who observed Yahweh's decrees in any sense of the term. Because, like Leviticus 7, 11 through 21, and 2 Chronicles 35, it displays exactly what a feast would look like and how they were supposed to approach the feast. And so if there's a sacrifice, it's almost like there is a feast coming up. But Yahweh's the subject of this verb undertaking the preparation of this day. So he has prepared. It's the causative. It's in the hifil stem, third masculine singular. So it's like a causing to prepare it. He is going to prepare a sacrifice, and Yahweh being the subject, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. And I just think the irony is thick here, because Judah, who you'd think would be the invited guests, the people who would be there, there's going to be a sacrifice, they're going to be there, they're going to participate in with Yahweh, and as we'll see, that's just never the case. One commentator notes that when the sinner will not repent and offer himself as a living sacrifice, then he himself becomes a sacrifice and a victim of his own sins. So I just think that's a great, succinct way of putting it, going on into the next portion of this here in verse 7. So he has prepared a sacrifice, and he has consecrated his guest. So there's going to be a sacrifice. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. But the attendees are going to enjoy the sacrifice a little bit differently than what Judah might think at the time. So the clause here is just really two simple verbal constructions. You have the hifil form of kadash, meaning he is set apart, he has consecrated, and it's just displaying Yahweh's agency and causing the event to happen again. So he's caused the sacrifice to happen, and he's causing the consecration for those who he's going to invite. So Yahweh is the subject here, and he's giving much more weight to the day with the passive verbal for those he is going to invite. And I really think this is important, because sacrifice pertains to purity. The Old Testament sacrifices were purging the sins, even temporally, for the people of Israel. And I think what is trying to be focused here is that there is going to be a sacrifice, and Jerusalem is going to be laid on the altar to be sacrificed here for the purging of their own sin, for their own sin against Yahweh. So he's going to invite the enemies' nations, and most commentators think the Babylonians are going to come in here, and they are going to be used as an instrument of judgment on the day of the Lord. They, the ones, are going to kill the sacrifice on the altar. Instead of the Babylonians being the ones who are on the altar and will be sacrificed and killed and done away with, it's Judah, it's Jerusalem. They are going to be the ones who are going to be sacrificed instead. So that's just verse 7 in a whole. Yahweh's going to judge his people. He's going to come, and instead of Judah being the blessed ones who are going to kind of enjoy the destruction of God's enemies are going to actually enjoy the destruction of God's people. So moving on into verse 8. First part of verse 8 says, "Then it will come about on the day of the Lord's sacrifice." So the day of the Lord theology, terminology continues to be cemented in all of these next three verses. He is preparing the day. And it's really interesting, again, the NIV and ESV neglected to place, there is a hayah verb, a cal-perfect third masculine singular, at the beginning of this. Sorry, I'm in a church office right now, so the phone will ring. I won't answer. But the hayah verb is right there. It's right in the text. You can't get away with it. And I think it's really producing a continual aspect of, yes, this is going to happen. Because the day is going to come. It will pass over them. And this is what it will be like. And so, like I said earlier, everything is moving forward saying, you have to pay attention. This is coming. Do not be sleeping on this. And I'm not sure why those other versions wouldn't allow that to clearly be drawn out in the same way that the NASB does. So there is a day coming. So the Lord's sacrifice is being prepared. Moving on to the second part of verse 8. That I will punish the princes, the king's sons. So the day of the Lord is here. There's going to be judgment, and now we're getting into the specifics of what the sacrifice is going to be. What is actually going to be laid upon the altar. And the judgment is coming, and we see here the Zavak, the classic sacrifice, and it's going to be clarified and expanded. And obviously we know it's judgment context because of the pakad, which, intrinsically is not a fearful word. The lexicon meaning is just to attend, to appoint, or to visit. But once you get it in the judgment context here, that's specifically what it means. It's going to be judgment, it's going to be wrath, it's going to come down, and it's going to be one of shame and judgment for whoever God is attending or whoever he is visiting. And so it's interesting to note here the kind of the shift. You had the third person verbs before, and now it's like, okay, Yahweh comes back and really just picks up where he left off in verses 2 and through 6. So that I will punish. So Yahweh being the subject, the third person subject, and the one preparing the sacrifices and consecrating the guests, and now he's speaking in the first person. And there has been a couple notes. Liberal scholars would think, well, these are scribal errors, these are scribal anticipations from verses 2 and 6 that we'll see, okay, well, Yahweh has to speak at some point, and so somebody must have come in and really shifted the verbs around. But I think our good friend old Palmer Robinson from Theology 3 is actually correct here. Here's what he says. This should be considered a characteristic literary device for vivifying the Lord's own involvement. And I think what it means is just a stamp of approval saying, okay, well, Zephaniah comes in, he says, okay, hush, be silent before the Lord, and then he kind of steps back, he kind of pulls the curtain open, and there's Yahweh, and he's going to be speaking on behalf of himself of, hey, this is what I am going to do. So the prophet stands in as a mouthpiece, says, okay, the Lord is coming, he steps back off the stage, and then Yahweh comes in and says, okay, here's what it's going to be. And so I think that's really what's happening here. And so you have, okay, the specific sacrifices are being named. You have princes and officials and the king's sons. So princes and officials, the Sarim here, which means an officer or a chief ruler, a representative of the king. And then you have the wow conjunction here, right in between. So I'm thinking that these are two completely separate entities at this point. So you have the king's officials, and then you have the king's sons. And I'm not sure specifically why I would say the princes and then the king's sons, just because in our English vernacular we understand that to be the same thing. And so I think there should be separated there, but there's officials and maybe there's king's sons left over. Not specifically, obviously, from Josiah being an 8-year-old, but the previous king's sons, Manasseh, ones who are still kind of reigning and who are still kind of a part of the regime that maybe Josiah wouldn't have been able to specifically maybe kick out of part of the reform. So I really think that these are two kind of separate entities. Maybe one religious and maybe one secular, just doing political and religious. Not exactly sure, but I think they are two separate entities. But it is interesting, though. You have the king's sons, and you have the officials, or the rulers, the court rulers, but you don't have the king here. And so judgment is coming down, and it seems at this point that Josiah is the king, and so Zephaniah being a part of royalty in verse 1:1, it's just interesting that the king is not there. And so I think commentators are pretty much unanimous about why. The two main theories are, one, he was just young. He was 8 years old, and so he wouldn't have had the weight or responsibility to bear the sins of the nation. He wanted to, maybe it's like the precursor to Age of Accountability or something. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there to see, like, well, if he is 8 years old and he's just come in and he wants to kind of put in this reform, then he wouldn't necessarily be specifically attributed to that. Secondly, the reform launched by Josiah, when he did found the scrolls, and then the desolate temple, and he says, hey, I'm going to put in this reform. We need to get back to the scriptures. We need to get back to God's law, and we need to rebuild. We need to do everything according to God's law. And maybe in that righteous character that he displayed even at a tender age of 8 years old, maybe that kind of allowed him to escape judgment during those times. But it is for sure that there are some in the royal court who are actually going to be judged for what they're doing. And so here we have, coming later, the next part in verse 8, and all who clothe themselves with foreign garments. So the all who clothe themselves, it's a substantival participle, masculine singular, so it's kind of the grouping, I should say, from, even though it is in the singular, all of those who are doing this action, clothing themselves, and it is separated by another conjunction here. And so you're thinking, okay, well, are the king's officials and the princes and all who clothe, are they separate? And I don't think you have to separate them out. The count here, I think, includes all of those. So it's whoever is a part of that is what I'm thinking this is trying to say. So not three separate entities, but you have the officials, you have the king's sons, and then whoever is a part of that is clothing themselves in these foreign garments or this foreign attire. And these are pretty ambiguous terms, like even as the princes, the king's officials, the sarim, they're all pretty ambiguous. We don't know exactly specifically who they're talking about because there's no names and there's nothing associated with them. And especially with the foreign attire, this is a pretty difficult thing just to nail down specifically, because especially there's no real textual evidence. The nakari, the foreignness, like what exactly is a foreignness describing, and it's not really that specific. But there are a couple pretty legitimate explanations, I think. Keel says that the plagiarism of foreign dress in general from both high royal court to even the peasants who made Egyptian or Assyrian customs normal in the house of Judah. And so what Keel is assessing that is just the in general, the dress, the foreign attire of other nations. Robertson rejects that argument basically wholeheartedly, pretty strongly, and he thinks it's basically grounded in the false worship of Judah, the worshiping of Baal, and the foreign garments are more of the religious aspect of it, the worshiping in the temple of Baal or bringing Baal into the temple, and then the priests and the religious ceremony. Everything is more about that foreign attire. But I think the commentator Barker, I think, has a better perspective on it, and it basically says, look, this is just contextualization. This is the king, this is the highest court, the ruling officials, even the king's sons. At this time, they'd be specifically talking about Manasseh and maybe their king's sons, his sons, and the rulers of that court deliberately trying to contextualize from the other nations. And we know that Assyria was a very powerful nation at that point. And so what they were trying to do is just say, hey, we want to be like you. And so they take on their customs, both religiously and culturally, secularly. It's all there, and they're just trying to be like the other nations. And so really that's what they're talking about. And so Barker says, for this reason, God determined to visit those in judgment who clad themselves in foreign clothes. The issue at stake was a distinctiveness of the people of God. And I think that's exactly the point. You have Deuteronomy 7 saying, I was the one that called you out of Egypt. I'm the one that took you out. You're possession of my own being. You are my people, and I'm going to call you out separately from the other nations. And here they are once again, as they've tried before, to go back and to be like the other nations. They weren't supposed to fear or be like, they were supposed to be their own people. So this isn't the only description. You have the officials, you have the king's sons, and then you have the foreign attire, all who clothe themselves, the entire royal court coming down, and then you have the continuation in verse 9 from the NASB, and I will punish all who leap on the temple threshold. And so here we have the first common singular pakad. Once again, he will visit them in judgment. He will do this, being in the imperfect form. He was going to do this, and so it creates a future aspect of the verb, and I will punish those who participate in the leaping of the threshold. So it's the same people. You have the officials, you have the king's sons. They remain as the object of wrath, and then those who are leaping over, or springing, as the word can also be interpreted as. It's a cal substantival participle. It's really used only a couple times in the Old Testament. Commentators are split. Exactly what does this mean? This leaping or jumping? It's still quite ambiguous. It's really funny. Calvin actually he interpreted it as dancing, and the reason why he did that is just because the looting and the stealing and the violence and the deceit that's talking about in the next section of verses here, they're just rejoicing over it. So they're dancing on the threshold, and really what the threshold was is a cross beam, kind of the bottom of the door frame where people would cross over into. So it's almost like a holy aspect. You're walking into the temple threshold. Now you are entering into the temple. Now you're crossing into someone else's land or someone else's home or place. And so it was really used in such a way to think of, okay, well, now I'm going into a place of deity, both in Israel, walking into the threshold of the temple of Judah, and then going into a temple of a false god. And so a couple times this is associated in 1 Samuel 5 with the temple of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, and really it's associated many times with temple. And so that's why I think the commentators really are trying to think, okay, well, first you have foreign clothes, you have the people who are trying to be like other nations, and then you have the religious aspects of this temple threshold. And so the superstitious religious practices of leaping over. So because I'm coming in, I don't want to step on the exact place where the god lives, because that's really what the threshold meant in the secular arena. Okay, well, there, the god of Dagon, he actually lives in the threshold, so he's right there, right at the entrance, and if you don't bring me what I want, then as you enter the doorway, then you could actually be killed. So very reminiscent of, going into the Holy of Holies. If you haven't consecrated yourself specifically in the way that Yahweh has asked you to, then boom, you keel over, you die, and the bells on your garment just stop, and they have to drag you out. So it was really a superstitious practice, more than anything else. And so this is why Robertson comes to the conclusion that he does. They observed the minutiae of a senseless pagan law, but run rampant over the basic ordinances of God in their own house. And so it's coming into, and we'll get to this in the next verse, the temple of the Lord. They're bringing in, and they're doing the exact same religious practices. And so there's a couple commentators who think the threshold is of the palace and not specifically of the temple, since all the jumping and the leaping is associated with the king's sons. But going into the next verse here, the leaping of the threshold usually relates to the temple. So the second part of verse 9 here, who fill the house of their Lord with violence and deceit. And so there is no conjunction here. There's no wow conjunction. So this is just kind of keeping on and on. Okay, so it's the one who's leaping over the thresholds, the ones who fill the house. So these are certainly talking about the same people, and they are doing the filling with violence and deceit. And so the actions associated with the leaping really have destruction terms associated with it. So that's why I think the Calvin interpretation really has nothing to do with it at this point, because it's more of a subjective translation, but there's violence and deceit and doing with the leaping. So they are trying to either steal and get out of there, whether it's superstitious piety or not. they really want to get in and get out and get their stuff back to the temple. And so what I really struggled with in this was, okay, does it have to be specifically religious piety, or does it have to be specifically a cultural contextualization? I'm not really sure. And Jeremiah really, I think, helps us out. In Jeremiah 7:9-11, he says this: "Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, and swear falsely, and offer sacrifices to Baal, and walk after other gods that you have not known? Then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, that you may do all these abominations? Has this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your sight? Behold, even I have seen it, declares the Lord." So the house of Judah, according to Jeremiah, they were distributing their religious piety with that of Baal, and they would come back and do whatever looting and do whatever they would do with the people of Judah, especially maybe specifically here, the king's officials. You have them maybe going even ransacking other temples, worshiping other temples, and coming back to the house of Yahweh, going out and stealing, maybe even from the people of Judah themselves, and coming back and thanking Yahweh. And so you have the foreign clothes, which doesn't have any real lexicon domain where you're going to say this is religious or it's just secular. You have the leaping, then you have the filling, who are associated with violence and deceit and robbing. And so the temple aspect, I think, is more the likely term of, okay, what they're doing with the filling and the robbing and the deceitfulness, that certainly has to do with religious piety. That certainly has to do with some sort of religious context, for sure. But I also certainly think that there is an aspect of it that has to do with cultural contextualization. And I don't think specifically that that's like a cop-out saying, okay, Dave, well, okay, it has to be one and it has to be another. I think there is a small balance that we can come to because they were trying to be like other nations. And so I think there is an aspect of, okay, well, Yahweh, when he gave his law, it had multiple interactions with both, hey, this is how you treat your neighbor, and this is how you treat me. Okay, when you come to the temple, this is how you're supposed to consecrate yourself. Hey, and these are the other laws where you're supposed to treat your neighbor as yourself. And so there was kind of, okay, culturally, this is how you're supposed to act, and then religiously, this is how you're supposed to act. And so I don't think there's a dichotomy here, even in this case. So I think it's more of the religious aspects of why. So they were going to other temples, they were worshiping at other temples, they would even ransack those temples and bring them back into the house of Yahweh. Because when you talk about the house of the Lord, which is the terminology here, the house of the Lord numerous times is associated with the temple of Yahweh and a place of worship. And so those in the courts were acting maybe even as spiritual priests at the time, even though maybe they weren't allowed to, and associate themselves with all of the religious practices. And so I think it's mainly religious practices here, but I think the foreign clothes and the people in the temple and the royal courts, it was a little bit of everything. They were trying to appease nations to make themselves feel better about themselves and maybe join themselves instead of having Yahweh as their leader of their nation, as their theocratic king. And then they would take specific gods, ransack the temples, bring them back, or even worship false gods in the temple of Yahweh. And so as we come to verse 10, this will close up pretty quickly, but on that day, declares the Lord, there will be a sound of a cry from the fish gate. So on that day, continues the terminology, we have declaring Yahweh. He is the one that is going to bring about this judgment, as we have already seen him multiple times. He says, hey, this is what's going to happen. You're going to see the destruction. You're going to see the sacrifice. Those who are consecrated from other nations, they're going to come down. They're going to sacrifice your people. Specifically target those in the kingdom who need to be purged, need to be purified, because they're bringing in sin to the nation, which Yahweh will not let go unpunished. And this is what's going to happen. There's going to be mass chaos, mass confusion, and virtually what's going to happen is just going to be a sound of a cry from all of Jerusalem. And so it will come to pass, declares the Lord, the great Neum Yahweh, connected to the day, utterance of the Lord. You're not going to get any stronger pronouncement. Okay, it will be, declares the Lord. It will happen, declares the Lord. So just as imminent and just as sure as the sacrifice is coming, the consecrated people are coming to kill the sacrifice, that's going to happen on the day of judgment. Here's what's going to happen next. There's going to be a screaming or a yelling or an outcry. It's really a cry of distress. They're going to look around them. They're going to be stopped in their tracks, just like they should have, with Yahweh in the hush going, I cannot believe what's going on here. And so there's going to be this distinct cry of distress going out. And specifically here it says the fish gate. Nehemiah gives us a little more insight of what this fish gate is. Verses 3:3 and 12:39. It is a gate, so it is a gate for sure, but why fish? We're not exactly sure. Most commentators, put this at the northern part of the city. Remember in geography class specifically, the north and the south were the most vulnerable places, and the north very specifically paraded itself as a great route for nations to come in and destroy, especially the Babylonians coming up and around down through to Jerusalem. But what commentators I think have come to the conclusion of, the fish gate is more just the marketing term of it. It was just commerce came through that gate. It was how it came into the city. Fishermen would come in, and so they named it the fish gate. And I don't have any real more conclusive evidence in that. All the commentators seem to be pretty specific on that for sure. And going on, so there's going to be three cries specifically. You have the cry of distress, a screaming or yelling, and then here you have, secondly in verse 10, a wail from the second quarter. And so this is a second distress cry. This is like a howling or a wailing, which Darren talked about in his. It's almost, you don't even know what's happening. You don't know what to do. There's so much going on. You're so upset that you just howl, you just wail. I don't know what else to do except to wail loudly. And so the wailing has come from a different district here, the second quarter. And the NIV interprets it as new, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't allow for any real translation of new at all. So it is the second quarter, and second quarter does appear in other places in the scriptures as well. And so it still seems to be like this is maybe central part or still in the north, maybe the second part of after the fish gate. It seems to be in the same area according to commentators, but this is still pretty ambiguous what fish gate and second quarter actually mean as well. So, but really it's just interesting that Jerusalem is set up in a specific way that will allow the Babylonians to come in from the north and raid the city, raid the courts, raid the palace, and everything that is associated from it. Lastly here in verse 10, and a loud crash from the hill. So this is going to finish the trio of loud distress signals on that day. This is all the things that are going to happen on that day. And this is a breaking or a fracture or a loud crash. And it's really intensified by the adjective, a loud crash. That really gave I think the translators the freedom to express that very nicely. So what exactly this means, I don't know. What are on the hills? What are near the hills? What would the loud crashes be on the hills? Because really what would be happening, the invited guests, the Babylonians would be coming in and they would be kind of ransacking everything that's going on. And so what some commentators, Robertson, continuing on with the religious theme of what is going on here, saying that, okay, well, with the spiritual aspect of this, due to sin, they were putting up all of these idols in the temple, and even anything associated, even with Yahweh himself, will come crashing down. What they're going to see is the temple, possibly even more so, but the palace they're going to see Jerusalem in utter destruction. It's just going to be an all-out caving in, a loud crash. It doesn't matter where you are. We know that it's a hilly part of that geographical location. There's a lot of hills, and so if you're around any part of there, you're going to see this entire city crash in, kind of implode. And so really what's going to happen is part of the temple, the palace, the idols, all of that is going to be crashing down. So I really think it's more of the city itself, not specifically just the idols, but just the city. So you have the Babylonians coming in, they're the invited guests, they're consecrated, they're being made useful to actually sacrifice God's own people because of their sin, because of the corrupt kings. They're coming in and they're actually going to purge the city of their sin and make sure that Judah is a holy people brought back to Yahweh. So even going through this, it was hard to kind of go through this text and think about the day of the Lord, to think about judgment, to think about the Deuteronomy 7, the love aspect of calling out his people, and they would still want to be like other nations. They would still, despite everything that he has done for them, struggle to actually submit themselves because of their hard-heartedness, their stubborn, their stiff-neckedness, and so hopefully that helped you guys get a little sense of how I came to this commentary, how I worked through some of the issues. Continue to love to talk to you guys more about this. I wish I was there to interact with you and your projects. I've loved hearing them, and just keep up all the great work. Keep striving, men. It's even been neat, interesting, because the last couple weeks has kind of been like a test almost of what it's going to be like, when we're not in this concentrated environment, this atmosphere where we're continually being sharpened, and it's been tough to stay disciplined, but the process, still going through this and still thinking of you guys, is always in the forefront of my mind. So I love each and every one of you. I can't wait to see you guys both in person and on screen, and we'll see you here real soon with the newest member of the Karenni family. Love you guys. Bye.